Christian topography demonstrated in irrefutable fashion that the earth truly is in the form of a tabernacle, and that only thus can we explain the most obscure phenomena.
Could you say that the most Christian of kings, John, I mean, would not follow the most Christian of topographies, which is not only that of Cosmos, but also that of the Holy Scriptures? What I say is that my Prester John knows nothing of the topography of your Cosmos. You told me yourself that the priest is a Nestorian. Now the Nestorians had a dramatic argument with other heretics, the Monophysites. The Monophysites held that the earth was made like a sphere, the Nestorians like a tabernacle.
Cosmas was also known to be a Nestorian, or in any case a follower of Nestor's teacher, Theodore of Mopsuestia, who all his life fought against the Monophysite heresy of John Philoponus of Alexandria, who followed pagan philosophers like Aristotle. Cosmas a Nestorian, Prester John a Nestorian. Both cannot but believe firmly in the earth as a tabernacle. Just a moment. Both your Cosmas and my priest are Nestorians, no argument there. But since, as far as I know, the Nestorians were wrong about Jesus and his mother, they could also be wrong about the shape of the universe, couldn't they? This is where my finest reasoning comes into play. I want to demonstrate to you that, if you want to find Prester John, you must in any case stick with Cosmas and not the pagan topographers. Let us suppose for a moment that Cosmas wrote things that are false.
Even so, these things are thought and believed by all the nations of the Orient that Cosmas visited, otherwise he wouldn't have learned them, in those lands beyond which lies the kingdom of Prester John, and surely the inhabitants of that kingdom itself think that the universe is in the form of a tabernacle, and they measure distances, confines, the course of rivers, the extension of seas, coasts, and gulfs, not to mention mountains, according to the wondrous design of the tabernacle.
Once again, it doesn't seem a valid argument to me, Buandulino said.
The fact that they believe they live in a tabernacle doesn't mean they really do live in one. Let me finish my demonstration.
If you ask me how to arrive at Chalcedon, where I was born, I could explain it to you easily.
Perhaps I measure the days of travel in a way different from you, or perhaps I call right what you call left. In any case, I have been told that the Saracens draw maps where the south is above and the north is below, and therefore the sun rises to the left of the lands they depict. But if you accept my way of representing the course of the sun and the shape of the earth, following my directions, you would surely arrive at the place where I want to send you, while you would never understand them if you refer to your maps. So, Zosimos concluded triumphantly, if you want to reach the land of Prester John, you must use the map of the world that Prester John would use and not your own. Mind you, even if your map is more correct than his. Buandulino was won over by the cogency of the argument and asked Zosimos to explain how Cosmos and, consequently, Prester John saw the universe. Ah no, Zosimos said. I know very well where to find the map, but why must I give it to you and to your emperor? If he were to give you enough gold to set out with a band of well-armed men. Exactly. From that moment on, Zosimos didn't allow one word to escape him on the subject of Cosmos's map, or, rather, he hinted at it every now and then, when he reached the peak of intoxication, but tracing vaguely with his finger some mysterious curves in the air, then falling silent, as if he had said too much. Buandulino would pour him more wine and ask him apparently bizarre questions. But when we are close to India, and our horses are exhausted, will we have to ride elephants? Perhaps, Zosimos said, because in India there live all the animals mentioned in your letter, and others besides, except for horses. Still they do have some, because they bring them in from Zinista. What country is that? A country where travelers go in search of worms for silk. Worms for silk. What does that mean? It means that in Zinista there exist some tiny eggs that are placed in women's bosoms and, enlivened by the warmth, they produce little worms. These are set on mulberry leaves, which nourish them. When they are grown, they spin silk from their bodies and wrap themselves in it, as in a tomb. Then they turn into marvelous, varicolored butterflies and they break free of the cocoon. Before flying away, the males penetrate the females from behind and both live without food in the warmth of their embrace until they die and the female dies brooding over her eggs. There's no trusting a man who wants to make you believe silk comes from worms, Buandulino said to Nikitas. He was spying for his bacillus, but he would have set out in search of the Lord of the Indies even in Frederick's pay. Then, when he got there, we would never see him again. And yet his mention of the map of Cosmos excited me. That map appeared to me like the Star of Bethlehem, except that it pointed in the opposite direction. It would tell me how to follow, backwards, the route of the Magi. And so, believing myself more clever than he, I prepared to lead him to excess in his intemperance, to make him duller and more talkative. And instead he was more clever than I. The next day I couldn't find him anywhere, and some of his fellows told me he had returned to Constantinople. He left me a farewell message. It said, "As fish die if they remain out of water, so monks who linger outside the cell weaken the vigor of their union with God. These past days I have dried up in sin, let me find again the cool living water." Maybe it was the truth. Not at all. He had found the way to milk gold from his bacillus. And to my harm. 17. Buandulino discovers that Prester John wrote to too many people. The following July, Frederick arrived in Venice by sea, accompanied from Ravenna to Chioggia by the Doge's son. Then he reached the church of San Niccolò al Lido, and on Sunday the 24th, in St. Mark's Square, prostrated himself at the feet of Alexander. The Pope raised him and embraced him with a show of affection, and all the witnesses sang the Te Deum.
It was truly a triumph, even if it was not clear for which of the two.
In any case, it ended a war that had lasted 18 years, and in those same days the emperor signed a 6-year truce with the communes of the Lombard League. Frederick was so happy that he decided to stay on in Venice for another month. It was August when, one morning, Christian of Book summoned Buandulino and his friends and asked them to come with him to the emperor. Arriving in Frederick's presence, Christian handed him, with a dramatic gesture, a parchment heavy with seals. "Here is the letter of Prester John," he said, "as it has reached me, confidentially, from the court of Byzantium."
The letter? Frederick exclaimed. Why, we haven't yet sent it. In fact, this is not ours, it's another letter. It's not addressed to you, but to the Bacillus Manuel. For the rest, it's the same as ours. So this Prester John first offers an alliance to me and then he offers it to the Rami? Frederick was enraged. Buandulino was dumbfounded, because the priest's letter, as he well knew, existed in a single draft, and he had written it. If the priest existed, he could also have written another letter, but surely not this one. He asked permission to examine the document, and after glancing at it in haste, he said, "No, it's not exactly the same. There are some little variants. If you will allow me, Father, I'd like to study it more closely." He withdrew with his friends, and together they read and reread the letter several times. First of all, it, too, was in Latin. Curious, Rabbi Solomon observed, because the priest is sending it to the Greek bacillus.
In fact, it began. "The priest Johannes, by the grace of God and power of our Lord Jesus Christ, King of Kings, greets Manuel, governor of the Rami, wishing him health and perpetual enjoyment of divine benediction." A second oddity, Buandulino said, he calls Manuel governor of the Rami, and not bacillus.
So it surely wasn't written by a Greek in the imperial train.
It was written by someone who doesn't recognize Manuel's title.
Therefore, the poet concluded, by the real Prester John, who considers himself the Dominus Dominantium. Let's proceed, Buandulino said, and I'll show you some words and phrases that weren't in our letter.
"Our Majesty has learned that you held in high esteem our excellency and that you had received word of our greatness. We have also learned from a secretary of ours that you desire to send us some things pleasing and interesting, for our delight. Being human, we gladly accept the gift, and through our apocrisiary, we are sending some token, desirous of knowing whether, like us, you follow the true faith and in every way believe in our Lord Jesus Christ. For while we are well aware of our mortality, your Greeklings believe that you are a god, even if we well know that you are mortal and subject to human corruption. In the breadth of our munificence, if you need something that may procure pleasure for you, inform us, either by a word to our apocrisiary or by a testimony of your affection." Here the oddities are too numerous, Rabbi Solomon said. On the one hand he treats the bacillus and his Greeklings with condescension and contempt approaching insult, on the other, for secretary, he uses the term apocrisiarius, which I believe is Greek. Its precise meaning is ambassador, Buandulino said, but listen to this. Where we said that at the priest's table sit the metropolitan of Samarkand and the archpriest of Susa, here it's written that there are the protopapas Samarkantinum and the archiprotopapas de Susis. And, further, among the wonders of the kingdom is mentioned an herb called asidios, which drives out evil spirits. Again, 3 Greek terms. So, the poet said, the letter is written by a Greek, but one who uses Greek very badly. I don't understand. Abdul meanwhile had picked up the parchment. There's something else. Where we mentioned the pepper harvest, there are added details. And here it says that in John's kingdom there are few horses. And here where we merely name salamanders, it says they are a species of worm, which wrap themselves in a kind of film like the worms that produce silk, and the film is then washed by the palace women to make royal cloths and dress which are washed only in a violent fire. What? What? Buandulino asked, alarmed. And finally, Abdul went on, in the list of creatures that inhabit the kingdom, among the horned men, the fauns and satyrs, the pygmies, the cynocephali, there also appear methagallinari, camethodorni, and thincyerte, all creatures we didn't name. By the Virgin Mother of God! Buandulino exclaimed. That worm story was told me by Zosimos. And it was Zosimos who also told me that, according to Cosmas Indicopleists, in India horses don't exist. And it was Zosimos who told me of methagallinari and those other beasts. Son of a whore, pot of excrement, liar, thief, hypocrite, trimmer and counterfeiter, adulterer, glutton, coward, voluptuary, sodomite, usurer, simoniac, necromancer, sower of discord, cheat.
Why, what did he do to you? Haven't you realized that yet? The evening that I showed him the letter, he got me drunk and made a copy of it.
Then he went back to that shit of a bacillus of his, told him that Frederick was about to reveal himself as friend and heir of Prester John, and they wrote another letter addressed to Manuel, sending it off before ours. That's why he appears so haughty towards the bacillus, to ward off suspicions that the letter might have been produced in his chancellery. That's why it contains so many Greek terms, to show that this is the Latin translation of an original written by John in Greek. But it's in Latin because it's meant to convince not Manuel but the chancelleries of the Latin kings and the Pope. There's another detail that escaped us, Kayat said. You remember the story of the grassel, which the priest was to send to the emperor. We wanted to remain reticent, speaking only of a verum arcum. Did you say anything about this to Zosimos? No, Buandulino said. I kept quiet about that. Here, your Zosimos has written your arcam.
The priest is sending the bacillus a Urarcam. And what's that? The poet wondered. Zosimos doesn't know that himself, Buandulino said. Look at our original letter. At this point Abdul's writing isn't very legible. Zosimos didn't understand what it was, he assumed it was some strange and mysterious gift, which only we knew about, and so that word is explained. Oh, the wretch. All my fault. I trusted him. How shameful. What can I say to the emperor?
It wasn't the first time they told lies. They explained to Christian and to Frederick the reasons why the letter had obviously been written by someone in Manuel's chancellery, precisely to prevent Frederick from circulating his, but they added that probably there was a traitor in the chancellery of the Holy Roman Empire, who had sent a copy of their letter to Constantinople. Frederick vowed that if the man was found he would have everything protruding from his body torn off. Then Frederick asked if they shouldn't worry about some initiative from Manuel.
What if the letter had been written to justify an expedition to the Indias?
Christian wisely pointed out that just 2 years earlier Manuel had moved against the Seleucid Sultan of Iconium, in Phrygia, and had suffered a dramatic defeat at Myriocephalum. Enough to keep him away from the Indias for the rest of his life. Indeed, when you thought about it, that letter was a specific if slightly puerile way to regain a bit of prestige just when he had lost a great deal. Still, did it make sense, at this point, to circulate the letter to Frederick? Wasn't it perhaps necessary to alter it, so that nobody would believe it had been copied from the one sent to Manuel?
Were you aware of this story, Master Nikitas? Buandulino asked. Nikitas smiled. In those days I was not yet 30, and I was collecting taxes in Paphlagonia. If I had been counselor to the bacillus, I would have advised him not to recur to such childish machinations.
But Manuel lent an ear to too many courtiers, to those who shared his bed, cuniculary, and the eunuch attendants of his chambers, even to servants, and often he succumbed to the influence of some visionary monks.
The thought of that worm gnawed at me. But also the fact that Pope Alexander was a worm worse than Zosimos, and worse than the salamanders, was discovered in September, when the imperial chancellery received a document that probably had been communicated also to the other Christian kings and to the Greek emperor. It was the copy of a letter that Alexander III had written to Prester John.
Surely Alexander had received a copy of the letter to Manuel. Perhaps he was aware of the old mission of Hugo of Jabala. Perhaps he feared that Frederick would draw some advantage from the news of the existence of the king and priest, and here Alexander was the first, not to receive an appeal, but to send one directly, for his letter said he had immediately dispatched an envoy of his to confer with the priest. Alexander, bishop, servant of the servants of God, to the most beloved Johannes, son in Christ, illustrious and magnificent sovereign of the Indias, wishes him health and sends his apostolic blessing. After which the Pope recalled that only one apostolic see, namely, Rome, had received from Peter the mandate to be caput et magistra of all believers. He said that the Pope had been told of the faith and the piety of John by his personal physician Magister Philip, and that this wise man, circumspect and prudent, had heard from trustworthy people that John wished finally to convert to the true faith, Roman and Catholic.
The Pope regretted that for the moment he could not send him dignitaries of high rank, also because they were ignorant of linguas barbaras et ignatas, but he was sending Philip, a discreet and most cautious man, to educate John in the true faith. As soon as Philip reached him, John should send the Pope a letter of his intentions, and Alexander advised him, the less he indulged in boasting about his power and wealth, the better it would be for him, if he wished to be received as a humble son of the Holy Roman Apostolic Church. Buandulino was scandalized by the idea that such shameless counterfeiters could exist in the world. Frederick shouted, venomously, "Son of the devil! Nobody has ever written to him, and out of spite he is the first to reply. And he is careful to refrain from calling him Johannes Presbyter, denying him all priestly dignity. He knows that John is a Nestorian," Buandulino added, "and he proposes, in so many words, that John renounce his heresy and make an act of submission to him." "It is surely a letter of supreme arrogance," the Chancellor Christian remarked. "He calls him son, doesn't send him even a mere bishop, but only his personal physician. He treats him like a child to be disciplined. This Philip must be stopped," Frederick then said. "Christian, send messengers, assassins, whatever you like, to overtake him along the way, strangle him, tear out his tongue, drown him in a stream. He must not arrive there. Prester John belongs to me." "Rest assured, dear father," Buandulino said. "In my opinion, this Philip has never set out, and it may be that he doesn't even exist. First, Alexander knows very well, if you ask me, that the letter to Manuel is bogus. Second, he has no idea where this Johannes is. Third, he wrote the letter precisely to say that Johannes belongs to him rather than to you, and further he is inviting both you and Manuel to forget the matter of the priest-king. Fourth, even if Philip existed and were traveling to the priest, and even if he arrived there truly, just think for a moment of what would happen if he returned empty-handed because Prester John wasn't converted. For Alexander it would be like receiving a handful of dung in the face. He can't take such a risk." In any case, it was by now too late to make the letter to Frederick public, and Buandulino felt dispossessed. He had begun dreaming of the priest's kingdom after the death of Otto, and since then almost 20 years had passed. 20 years gone for nothing.
Then he picked himself up. No, the priest's letter fades into nothingness, or becomes lost in a host of other letters. At this point anyone who so wishes can invent an amorous correspondence with the priest. We live in a world of certified liars, but this doesn't mean that we have to give up seeking his kingdom.
After all, Cosmos's map still exists.
It would suffice to find Zosimos again, tear it away from him, and travel towards the unknown.
But where had Zosimos ended up? Even if we were to learn that he was living, covered with prebends, in the imperial palace of his basileus, how to go and unmask him there, amid the entire Byzantine army? Buandulino began questioning travelers, envoys, merchants, seeking some news of that scoundrel monk.
At the same time he never stopped reminding Frederick of the project. "Dear father," he would say, "now it makes even more sense than before, because in the past you could think that the kingdom was only a fancy of mine. Now you know that the basileus of the Greeks believes in it, and so does the Pope of the Romans, and in Paris they told me that if our mind is able to conceive of a thing that is greater than anything, surely that thing exists.
I am on the trail of someone who can give me information about the correct route. Authorize me to spend some money." He succeeded in gaining enough gold to corrupt all the Greeklings who passed through Venice. He had been put in touch with reliable people in Constantinople, and he was awaiting news. When he received it, he would have only to induce Frederick to make a decision. More years of waiting, Master Nikitas, and meanwhile your Manuel also died. Even if I had not yet visited your country, I knew enough about it to think that, with a new basileus, all the old advisors would be done away with. I prayed to the Blessed Virgin and all the saints that Zosimos had not been killed. Even blinded, he would still suit me, he had only to give me the map so I could read it. And at the same time I felt the years flowing from me like blood. Nikitas urged Buandulino not to allow himself to be disheartened now by his former disappointment. He ordered his cook and servant to outdo themselves, and he wanted their last meal prepared under the sun of Constantinople to remind him of all the sweetness of his sea and his land. And so he wanted lobsters and porgies on the table, boiled prawns, fried crabs, lentils with oysters and clams, sea dates, accompanied by a puree of beans and rice with honey, girt with a crown of fish roe, and all served with Cretan wine. But this was only the first course.
Afterwards came a stew that wafted a delicious aroma, and in the pan were steaming 4 hearts of cabbage, hard and white as snow, a carp and about 20 little mackerel, fillets of salt fish, 14 eggs, a bit of Wallachian sheep cheese, all bathed in a good quart of oil, sprinkled with pepper, and flavored with 12 heads of garlic.
But with that second dish he asked for a wine of Ganos. 18. Buandulino and Calandrina. From the courtyard of the Genoese came the laments of Nikita's daughters, who were reluctant to have their faces smeared with dirt, accustomed as they were to the vermilion of their cosmetics. Calm down, Grillo said to them, beauty alone doesn't make a woman. And he explained that it wasn't even certain that these marks of ringworm and pox they were applying to their faces would suffice to disgust a lusty pilgrim. Those men who were satisfying themselves on anyone they found, young or old, healthy or sick, Greeks or Saracens or Jews, because in these matters religion doesn't count. To arouse disgust, he added, they should be covered with bumps, like a grater. Nikita's wife lovingly collaborated in uglifying her daughters, adding a sore on the forehead or some chicken skin on the nose, to make it seem half-eaten away. Buandulino looked sadly at that sweet family group, and said abruptly, and so, as I was casting about, not knowing what to do, I also took a wife. He told the story of his marriage in a less merry tone, as if it were a painful memory. At that time I was moving back and forth between the court and Alessandria. Frederick still couldn't swallow the fact of that city's existence, and I was trying to patch things up between my fellow citizens and the emperor. The situation was more favorable than in the past. Alexander III was dead, and Alessandria had lost its protector. The emperor was gradually coming to terms with the Italian cities, and Alessandria could no longer represent itself as the bulwark of the League. Genoa had by now come over to the side of the empire, and Alessandria had everything to gain by going with the Genoese, and nothing to gain by remaining the only city hostile to Frederick. A solution had to be found that would be honorable for all. So, while I was spending my days talking with my fellow citizens, then returning to court to sound out the emperor's mood, I became aware of Calandrina.
She was the daughter of Guisco, and she had grown up more or less before my eyes, though I hadn't realized she had become a woman.
She was very sweet, and she moved with a somewhat awkward grace. After the story of the siege, my father and I were considered the saviors of the city, and she looked at me as if I were St. George. When I spoke with Guasco, she would crouch near me, her eyes shining, as she drank in my words. I could have been her father, because she was barely 15 and I was 38. I don't know if I had fallen in love with her, but I liked seeing her around me, and I began telling incredible stories to the others so that she would hear me. Guasco, too, had become aware of this. It's true that he was a Miles, and therefore something bigger than a ministerial like me, a peasant's son into the bargain, but, as I told you, I was the city's pet, I wore a sword on my hip, I lived at court. It would not have been a bad match, and it was Guasco himself who said to me, why don't you marry Calandrina?
She's become a burden here, she drops the pans, and when you're away she spends all her time at the window looking out to see if you're coming.
It was a fine wedding, in the church of San Pietro, the cathedral we had given to the Pope, rest his soul, though the new one didn't even know it existed. It was a strange marriage, because after the first night I had to go off and join Frederick, and so it went for a good year, with a wife I saw once in a blue moon, and it touched my heart to see her joy every time I came back. So you loved her?
I think I did, but it was the first time I'd taken a wife, and I didn't really know what to do with her, except those things that husbands do at night, but during the day I didn't know if I should pat her like a child, treat her as a lady, scold her for her clumsiness, because she still needed a father, or forgive her everything, and perhaps spoil her instead.
But, at the end of the first year, she told me she was expecting a child, and then I began looking at her as if she were the Virgin Mary.
When I came home, I would beg her forgiveness for having been away. I took her to Mass on Sunday to show everybody that Buandulino's fine wife was about to give him a son, and on the few evenings we spent together we told each other what we would do with that buandulino.
Calandrinino she was carrying in her belly. She sometimes imagined that Frederick would give him a dukedom, and I was almost ready to believe it myself.
I told her about the kingdom of Prester John, and she said she wouldn't let me go there alone for all the gold in the world, because there was no telling how many beautiful ladies there were down there, and she wanted to see if any place could be finer and bigger than Alessandria and Salero put together. Then I told her about the Grassel and her eyes widened. Just think, dear Buandulino, you go down there, you come back with the cup from which our Lord drank, and you become the most famous knight of all Christendom. You build a shrine for this Grassel at Moncastello, and they come to see it all the way from Quargnento.
We daydreamed like children, and I said to myself, poor Abdul, you believe that love is a faraway princess, but mine is so close that I can tickle her behind the ear, and she laughs and tells me I give her goosebumps. But it was short-lived. Why? Because while she was pregnant, the Alessandrians made a pact with Genoa against the people of Silvano d'Orba. They were just a handful, but still they roamed the area and robbed the peasants. Calandrina that day went out beyond the city walls to gather some flowers because she had heard I was about to arrive. She stopped near a flock of sheep to joke with the shepherd, who was one of her father's men, and a band of those bastards rushed over to seize the sheep. Perhaps they didn't mean to harm her, but they roughly pushed her about, flung her to the ground, the sheep ran off, trampling her underfoot. The shepherd had already taken to his heels, and when her family found her, late in the evening, after realizing she hadn't come home, she had a fever. Guasco sent someone to find me. I came home at full speed, but meanwhile 2 days had gone by.
I found her in bed, dying, and, on seeing me, she tried to apologize because, she said, the baby had come out ahead of time, and he was already dead, and she tormented herself because she hadn't even been able to give me a son.
She looked like a little wax Madonna, and you had to put your ear to her mouth to hear what she was saying. Don't look at me, Buandulino, she said, my face is all splotchy from weeping, and so you find not only a bad mother but also an ugly wife. She died begging my forgiveness, while I was asking hers, for not having been at her side in her moment of danger. Then I asked to see the little corpse, but they didn't want to show it to me.
It was.
Buandulino stopped. He held his face up, as if reluctant to let Nikita see his eyes. It was a little monster, he said, after a moment, like the ones we imagined in the land of Prester John.
The face had tiny eyes, like 2 slits, a very thin chest, with little arms that looked like a polyp's tentacles.
And from its belly to its feet it was covered with fine white hair, as if it were a sheep. I couldn't look at it for long. I ordered it buried, but I didn't know if a priest could be called.
I left the city and wandered all night around the marsh, telling myself that until then I had spent my life imagining creatures of other worlds, and in my fancy they seemed wondrous portents, whose diversity bore witness to the infinite power of the Lord. But then, when the Lord asked me to do what all other men do, I had generated not a portent but a horrible thing.
My son was a lie of nature.
Otto was right, but more than he had thought. I was a liar and I had lived the life of a liar to such a degree that even my seed had produced a lie.
A dead lie. And then I understood. You mean? Nikitas ventured, you decided to change your life. No, Master Nikitas. I decided that if this was my fate, it was useless for me to try to become like other men. I was by now consecrated to falsehood. It is hard to explain what was going through my head. I said to myself, all the time that you were inventing, you invented things that were not true, but then became true.
You made San Buandulino appear. You created a library at Saint Victoire. You sent the Magi wandering about the world. You saved your city by fattening a scrawny cow. If there are learned doctors in Bologna, it is also your merit. In Rome you caused Mirabilia to appear that the Romans themselves had never dreamed of, starting with the gabble of that Hugo of Jabala. You created a kingdom of supreme beauty. Then you loved a ghost, and you made her write letters she had never written, and those who read them went into ecstasy, including the lady who had never written them, and she was an empress. But the one time you wanted to do something true, with the most sincere of women, you failed. You produced something no one can believe in or desire to exist. So it is best for you to withdraw into the world of your portents, for there at least you can decide yourself how portentous they are.
19. Buandulino changes the name of his city. Oh poor Buandulino, Nikita said, as they continued the preparations for their departure, robbed of a wife and a son, in the prime of life.
And I, who could lose tomorrow the flesh of my flesh and my beloved wife at the hand of some of these barbarians? O Constantinople, Queen of cities, tabernacle of the Lord Most High, pride and glory of your ministers, delight of foreigners, empress of imperial cities, most rare spectacle of things rare to be seen, what will become of us who are about to abandon you, naked as when we came forth from our mothers?
When shall we see you again, not as you now are, vale of tears, trampled by armies? Silence, Master Nikitas, Buandulino said to him, and remember this may be the last time you will be able to taste these delights worthy of Apicius.
What are these little balls of meat that have the aroma of our spice market?
Keftedas, and the aroma comes from cinnamon and a bit of mint, Nikitas replied, already comforted. And for this last day I have succeeded in having a little and is brought to us, which you must drink while it dissolves in water like a cloud. It's good, it doesn't dull the mind, it makes you feel as if you were dreaming, Buandulino said. If only I could have drunk some after Calandrina's death, perhaps I could have forgotten her, as you are already forgetting the misfortunes of your city as you lose all fear of what will happen tomorrow. But instead, I became heavy with the wine of our parts, which puts you suddenly to sleep, and when you wake you're worse off than before. It took Buandulino a year to emerge from the melancholy madness that had gripped him, a year of which he remembered nothing except that he went on long rides through the woods and over the plains. Then he would stop in some place and drink until he plunged into long and agitated sleep.
In his dreams he saw the moment when he finally reached Zosimos and tore from him not only his beard, but also the map, in order to reach a kingdom where all newborn infants would be Thinsiarte and Methagallinary.
He did not return to Alessandria, fearing that his father or his mother, or Guasco and his family, would talk to him of Calandrina, and of the son never born. Often he took refuge with Frederick, paternally concerned and understanding, trying to distract him with talk of the great things Buandulino could do for the empire. Until one day, he said Buandulino should make up his mind and find a solution for Alessandria, for his wrath by now had evaporated, and to please Buandulino he wanted to heal that vulnus without being forced to destroy the city. This mission gave Buandulino new life. Now Frederick was preparing to sign a definitive peace with the Lombard communes, and Buandulino told himself that in the end it was all a question of pride. Frederick could not tolerate the idea of a city they had made without his permission, and one that, furthermore, bore the name of his enemy.
Very well, if Frederick could found that city anew, even in the same place but with another name, as he had done at Lodi, in another place but with the same name, then he would not end up empty-handed.
As for the Alessandrians, what did they want? To have a city and to conduct their business. It was pure chance that they had named it after Alexander III, who was dead, and therefore couldn't take offense if they now gave it a different name.
Hence the idea. One fine morning Frederick would come with his knights to the walls of Alessandria, all the inhabitants would come forth, a cohort of bishops would enter the city, they would deconsecrate it, if it could be said ever to have been consecrated, or they would debaptize it and then rebaptize it with the name Caesarea, city of Caesar. The Alessandrians would pass slowly before the emperor, paying him homage, then they would go back inside, taking possession of their brand new city, as if it were another, founded by the emperor, and they would live happily ever after. Obviously, Buandulino was recovering from his despair, with another fine exploit of his fervid imagination. Frederick did not dislike the idea, but in that period there were some difficulties in his returning to Italy, because he was settling some important matters with his Alaman vassals.
Buandulino assumed responsibility for the negotiations. He hesitated before entering the city, but at the gate his parents came towards him, and all three of them dissolved in liberating tears.
His old comrades acted as if Buandulino had never married, and before he could begin talking of his mission, they dragged him off to their old tavern, getting him good and drunk, but with a tart little white wine of Gavi, not enough to put him to sleep but enough to stimulate his genius.
Then Buandulino told them his idea. The first to react was Gagliardo. When I'm with this character, I become as foolish as he is. Now really, do we have to play out this farce, first coming out, then going back inside, and after you, no after you? All we need is a piper and we'll be dancing the Trescone for the feast of San Buandulino.
No, this is a good idea, Boidi said, but afterwards, instead of being Alessandrians, we'll have to call ourselves Caesarines, and I'd be ashamed, I couldn't go and say it to the people of Asti.
Enough of all this nonsense. No matter what, they'll still know us for who we are. Oberto del Foro interjected. For my part, they can go ahead and rename the city, but it's the passing in front of him and rendering homage that I can't stomach. After all, we're the ones who put one over on him, not him on us, so he shouldn't act too grand. Cutica of Quarnento said the rebaptizing was all right, and who cared if the city was called Caesaretta or Caesarona, for him even Caesarea was fine, or Olivia or Sophronia or Eutropia. The problem is whether Frederick will want to send us his governor, or will he be satisfied to give his legitimate investiture to the consuls we would elect.
Go back and ask him what he plans to do, Guisco said.
And Buandulino said, yes, of course. I keep going back and forth across the Alps until you come to an agreement. No, sir. You delegate full powers to 2 of your people and they come with me to the emperor and they work out something that suits everybody. If Frederick sees another pair of Alessandrians, he'll get a case of worms, and to get rid of the 2, you'll see, he'll accept an agreement. So 2 envoys from the city set out with Buandulino, Anselmo Canzani and Teobaldo, one of the Guiscos. They met the emperor at Nuremberg and the agreement was reached. Even the question of the consuls was resolved promptly. It was only a matter of saving appearances. The Alessandrians should go ahead and elect them. It would suffice if the emperor then appointed them.
As for the homage, Buandulino took Frederick aside and said to him, Father, you can't come yourself, you must send a legate.
So you send me. After all, I'm a ministerial, and as such, in your immense kindness, you bestowed on me the sash of knighthood, and I'm a Ritter, as they say here. Yes, but you still belong to the nobility of service. You can have feudal estates, but you can't confer them, and you are not entitled to have vassals, and... What do you think that matters to my compatriots? For them, it's enough for a man to have a horse and issue orders. They pay homage to your representative, and hence to you, but your representative is me, and I'm one of them, and therefore they don't have the impression of paying homage to you.
Then, if you like, the oaths and all those other things can be made to an imperial chamberlain of yours who is beside me, and they won't even know who's the more important.
You also have to understand how people are made. If in this way we settle things finally, won't it be good for all? So in mid-March of 1183 the ceremony took place.
Buandulino was in dress uniform, and he looked more important than the Marquis of Monferrato. His parents devoured him with their eyes, as he, hand on the hilt of his sword, sat astride a white horse that wouldn't keep still.
He's decked out like a lord's dog, his mother said, dazzled.
He was flanked by 2 ensigns bearing the imperial standards, the imperial chamberlain Rudolf, and many other nobles of the empire, and more bishops than you could count, though at that point nobody was noticing details.
There were also representatives of the other Lombard cities, such as Lanfranco of Como, Ciro Salambin of Pavia, Filippo of Casali, Gerardo of Novara, Patinario of Osona, and Malavisca of Brescia.
When Buandulino had taken his place before the gate of the city, all the Alessandrians filed out, with their little children in their arms and the old men leaning on them, and even the ill were carried out on carts, including the simple-minded and the lame, along with the heroes of the siege who had lost a leg or an arm, or even bare-assed on a plank with wheels, propelling themselves with their hands.
Since they didn't know how long they would have to remain outside, many brought along provisions. Some had bread and salami, others, roast chickens, and still others, baskets of fruit, and in the end it all looked like a grand picnic. Truth to tell, it was very cold, and the fields were covered with frost, so sitting down was torture. Those citizens, now deprived of power, stood erect, stamped their feet, blew on their hands, and someone said, "Can we get this show over with quickly? We've left our pots on the stove." The emperor's men entered the city and nobody saw what they did, not even Buandulino, who was outside, waiting for the return procession. At a certain point a bishop came out and announced that this was the city of Caesarea, by grace of the Holy and Roman Emperor. The imperials behind Buandulino raised their arms and their standards, cheering the great Frederick.
Buandulino spurred his horse to a trot, approached the first line of citizens and, in his position as imperial envoy, announced that to this noble city including the 7 towns of Gamendio, Marengo, Bergoglio, Rovereto, Solero, Foro, and Ovilio, the name of Caesarea had been given and he ceded it to the inhabitants of the aforenamed places, here gathered, inviting them to take possession of this turreted gift. The imperial chamberlain listed all the articles of the agreement, but everyone was cold, and they allowed the details of the donation to pass in haste. The regalia, the curatia, the tolls, and all those things that made a treaty valid. "Come, Rudolph," Buandulino said to the imperial chamberlain, "it's all a farce anyway, and the sooner it's over the better." The exiles took the return path, and they were all there except Oberto del Foro, who hadn't accepted the shame of this homage. He who had defeated Frederick had delegated in his stead, as Nunci Civitatis, Anselmo Canzani and Teobaldo Guasco. Passing before Buandulino, the nunci of the new Caesarea swore their solemn oath, though speaking in Latin so horrible that if afterwards they said they had sworn the opposite nobody could have contradicted them. As for the others, they followed with lazy, grudging salutes, some saying salve, Buandulino, how are things, Buandulino, hey there, Buandulino, long time no see, Well, here we are again,
As Gagliardo went by, he muttered that this thing wasn't serious, but he was sufficiently sensitive to raise his hat, and inasmuch as he raised it in front of that scapegrace son of his, as an homage, it was more effective than if he had licked Frederick's feet.
When the ceremony was over, both the Lombards and the Teutonics went off as quickly as possible, as if they were ashamed of themselves.
Buandulino, on the contrary, followed his fellow citizens inside the walls and heard some saying. "Look at this fine city.
You know something.
It looks just like that other one. What was the name? That was here before. These Alamans, they're really geniuses. In no time at all they've run up a city that's a true masterpiece. Just look over there. That house looks exactly like mine. They've remade it exactly like it was. Now, boys," Buandulino shouted, "be thankful you pulled it off without having to pay Iugashicum. As for you, don't put on too many airs. You'll end up believing what you say."
It was a beautiful day.
Buandulino laid aside all the signs of his power and went off to celebrate. In the cathedral square, girls were dancing in a circle. Boydie took Buandulino to the tavern, and in that cave with its aroma of garlic they all went to draw the wine directly from the barrels, because on that day there were to be no more masters or servants, especially the tavern serving wenches, some of whom had already been carried upstairs, but as everyone knows, men are born hunters. "Blood of Jesus Christ," Gagliardo said, pouring a bit of wine on his sleeve, to show that the cloth wouldn't absorb it and the drop remained compact, with ruby glints, a sign that this was good stuff.
Now we'll go on calling it Caesarea for a few years, at least on the parchments with seals, Boydie whispered to Buandulino, but then we'll start calling it what we called it before, and I want to see if anyone cares.
"Yes," Buandulino said, "then we'll call it by its old name, because that's what that angel Calandrina called it, and now that she's in paradise, there's a risk she might send her benedictions to the wrong address." "Master Nikitas, I felt almost reconciled to my misfortunes, because from me the son I never had and the wife I had too briefly at least had received a city that nobody would afterwards oppress. Perhaps," Buandulino added, inspired by the Annis, "one day Alessandria will become the new Constantinople, the third Rome, all towers and basilicas, a wonder of the universe." "May God so will," Nikitas wished, raising his cup. 20. Buandulino finds Zosimos again. In April, at Constance, the Emperor and the League of the Lombard Communes signed a final agreement. In June, confused reports were arriving from Byzantium. Manuel had been dead for 3 years. His son Alexius, hardly more than a child, had succeeded him.
A naughty child, Nikitas commented, who, still without any knowledge of joys and sorrows, devoted his days to the hunt and to his horses, playing with young boys, while at court various suitors aimed at winning his mother the dowager, covering themselves with perfume like idiots and bedecking themselves with necklaces as women do, others dedicating themselves to squandering public funds, each pursuing his own desires and combating the others, as if an erect supporting column had been removed and everything was tilting the wrong way.
The omen that had appeared at Manuel's death was achieved, Nikitas said. A woman gave birth to a male child with stunted, badly articulated limbs, and an overlarge head, and this was a presage of polyarchy, which is the mother of anarchy.
What I learned immediately from our spies was that a cousin, Andronicus, was conspiring in the shadows, Buandulino said.
He was the son of a brother of Manuel's father, and was therefore a kind of uncle to little Alexius. Until then he had been in exile, because Manuel considered him untrustworthy, a traitor. Now he slyly ingratiated himself with young Alexius, as if repentant of his past actions, desirous of offering him protection, and little by little he gained increasing power.
Between plots and poisonings, he pursued his ascent to the imperial throne until, when he was by then old, steeped in envy and hatred, he spurred the citizens of Constantinople to revolt, having himself proclaimed basileus. As he received the sacred host, he swore he was assuming power to protect his still young nephew. But immediately afterwards, his evil genius, Stephen Agiochristophoриtes, strangled the boy Alexius with a bowstring. When the wretched boy's corpse was brought to him, Andronicus ordered it to be cast into the depths of the sea, after severing the head, which was then hidden in a place called Catabates. I don't know why, since it is an old monastery long in ruins, just outside the Constantinian walls. I know why. My spies reported that, with Agiochristophoриtes, there was a very active monk whom Andronicus had wanted with him, after the death of Manuel, for he was an expert in necromancy. His name happened to be Zosimos, and reputedly he was able to raise the dead among the ruins of that monastery, where he had established an underground palace for himself.
So then I had found Zosimos, or at least I knew where to catch him.
This happened in November of 1184, when Beatrice of Burgundy suddenly died.
Another silence. Buandulino drank a long draught.
I understood that death is a punishment.
It was right that, after the second woman of my life, I should also lose the first. I was past 40. I had heard that in Terdona there was, or there had been, a church where those baptized lived to 40. I had passed the limit granted to the fortunate. I could die in peace. I couldn't bear the sight of Frederick. The death of Beatrice had prostrated him. He wanted to concern himself with his older son, who was now 20 but increasingly frail, and Frederick was slowly preparing the succession of his second son, Henry, having him crowned King of Italy. He was growing old, my poor father, now he was white-beard. I had returned once to Alessandria and found that my blood parents were still older. Pale, thin, delicate as those balls of white stuff that roll around the fields in spring, bend like saplings on a windy day, they spent their waking hours around the fire quarreling over a misplaced bowl or an egg that one or the other of them had dropped. And they scolded me, every time I went to see them, because I never came. I decided then to sell my life cheap, and go to Byzantium to look for Zosimos, even if that could mean ending up blinded, in a dungeon, for my remaining years.
Going to Constantinople could be dangerous because, a few years earlier, stirred up by Andronicus himself, even before he seized power, the inhabitants of the city had revolted against the Latins living there, killing no small number of them, looting their houses, and forcing many to take refuge in the Prince's Islands. Now it seemed that Venetians, Genoese, and Pisans could again circulate in the city, because they were people indispensable to the welfare of the empire. But William II, King of Sicily, was moving against Byzantium, and for the Greeklings, Sicilian or Roman, Provençal or Alaman, all were Latins, and there was scant distinction.
So they decided to sail from Venice and arrive by sea, like a caravan of merchants from Taprobane. This was Abdul's idea.
Very few had any idea where Taprobane was, perhaps no one, nor in Byzantium would they know what language was spoken there.
So Buandulino dressed up as a Persian dignitary.
Rabbi Solomon, who would have been singled out as a Jew even in Jerusalem, was the company's physician, with a fine dark cloak all spangled with signs of the zodiac. The poet looked like a Turkish merchant wearing a pale blue kaftan. Kayat could have been one of those Lebanese who dress badly but have pockets full of gold pieces. Abdul shaved his head to eliminate his red hair, and in the end resembled a eunuch of high degree, and bore on past as his servant.
As for their language, they decided to communicate among themselves in the thieves' argot they had learned in Paris, which they all spoke to perfection, and this says a great deal about their commitment to their studies in those blissful days. Incomprehensible even to Parisians, for the Byzantines it could well be the language of Taprobane.
After leaving Venice in early summer, they learned at a port of call in August that the Sicilians had conquered Thessalonia, and were perhaps swarming over the northern coast of the Propontis. So, having entered that arm of the sea in the heart of the night, the captain preferred to make a wide curve towards the opposite shore and head for Constantinople as if they were arriving from Chalcedon.
To console them for that detour, he promised them an imperial arrival, because, he said, that is the way to discover Constantinople, arriving there with the first rays of the sun in your face. When Buandulino and his friends went out on deck towards dawn, they felt a moment's disappointment, because the shore was veiled in a thick haze, but the captain reassured them. This was the right approach to the city, slowly, in that haze, which, for that matter, already absorbing the first light of dawn, would little by little be dispelled. After another hour's sail, the captain pointed to a white dot, and it was the top of a dome, which seemed to pierce the mist. Soon, within the whiteness the columns of some palaces were outlined along the coast, and then the shapes and colors of some houses, spires turning pink, and, gradually, below, the walls and their towers.
Abruptly, there was a great shadow, still covered by layers of vapor that rose from the top of a high plain, and strayed through the air, until you could see, harmonious and gleaming in the sun's first rays, the dome of St. Sophia, as if it had miraculously risen out of nothingness. From that moment on came a continuous revelation, with more towers and more domes emerging in a sky that cleared little by little, amid a triumph of green spaces, golden columns, white peristyles, rosy marbles, and the entire glory of the imperial palace of the Buandulino, with its cypresses in a pied labyrinth of hanging gardens.
And then the entrance to the Golden Horn, with the great chain barring entry, and the white tower of Galata on the right. As he told the story, Buandulino was moved, and Nikitas repeated sadly how beautiful Constantinople had been, when it was beautiful. Ah, it was a city full of emotions, Buandulino said. The moment we arrived we had an idea of what was happening there. We turned up at the Hippodrome just as they were preparing for the torture of an enemy of the Basileus. Andronicus was virtually insane. Your Latins from Sicily had put Thessalonia to the sword and fired it.
Andronicus had had some fortifications constructed, then he seemed to lose interest in the danger. He gave himself over to a life of dissipation, saying their enemies were not to be feared. He put to torture those who could have helped him. He left the city in the company of prostitutes and concubines, buried himself in the valleys and forests as animals do, followed by his inamoratas like a cock by his hens, like Dionysus and his bacchants. He had only to put on a stag's skin and a saffron-colored dress.
He frequented only flautists and heterae, as unrestrained as Sardanapalus, as lascivious as a polyp. He was unable to bear the weight of his own debaucheries, and he ate an unclean animal of the Nile, like a crocodile, which was said to favor ejaculation. But I wouldn't want you to consider him a bad ruler.
He also did many good things. He limited taxes, issued edicts to prevent the wrecking of ships in our ports in order to sack them. He restored the ancient underground aqueduct, and also the Church of the Holy 40 Martyrs.
A good man, in short. Don't put words in my mouth. The fact is that a basilisk can use his power to do good, but to hold on to his power he has to do evil. You too have lived at the side of a man of power, and you too have admitted that he could be noble and wrathful, cruel and concerned with the common good. The only way not to sin is to seek isolation on the top of a column as the sainted fathers did in the past, but by now those columns have fallen in ruins. I won't argue with you about how this empire should be governed. It's yours, or at least it was. I'll go back to my story. We've come to live here, with these Genoese, because they were my trustworthy spies, as you must have sensed. And indeed Boimondo discovered one day that, on that very evening, the basilisk would go to the ancient crypt of Catabates to perform rites of divination and magic. If we were to find Zosimos, that was our chance. When evening had fallen, they went towards the walls of Constantine to where there was a kind of little pavilion, not far from the Church of the Most Holy Apostles. Boimondo said that from there we would reach the crypt directly, without going through the monastery's church.
He opened a door, had them descend some slippery little steps, and they found themselves in a corridor reeking of damp.
Here we are, Boimondo said. Just keep going a bit and you'll be in the crypt. You're not coming? I'm not coming anywhere where they do things with the dead. When it comes to doing things, I prefer the people to be alive and female. Going forward, they passed through a chamber with a low vaulted ceiling, where they could discern couches, rumpled beds, goblets lying on the floor, unwashed dishes with the remains of some debauch.
Obviously that glutton Zosimos performed here not only his rituals with the deceased but also some ritual that wouldn't have displeased Boimondo. But all that orgiastic equipment had been piled up in apparent haste in the darker corners, because that evening Zosimos had arranged to meet the basilisk to make him speak with the dead and not with strumpets, because, as everyone knows, Buandulino said, people will believe anything provided it's the dead who speak.
Beyond the room, some lights could be seen, and in fact they entered a circular crypt illuminated by two tripods, already alight. The crypt was surrounded by a colonnade, and behind the columns they could glimpse openings of passages, or tunnels, leading God knows where.
In the center of the crypt was a basin filled with water, its edge forming a kind of channel filled with an oily substance, which ran in a circle around the surface.
Next to the basin, on a little column, was a vague object, covered by a red cloth.
Buandulino realized that Andronicus, after having entrusted himself to ventriloquists and astrologers, and having tried in vain to find in Byzantium someone who, like the ancient Greeks, could foretell the future through the flight of birds, and with no faith in the wretches who boasted that they could interpret dreams, had by now given himself over to hydromants, who, like Zosimos, could draw presages by immersing in water something that had belonged to a deceased person.
Passing behind the altar, they turned and saw an iconostasis, dominated by Christ Pantocrator, who stared at them with widened, stern eyes. Buandulino remarked that, if Boimondo's information was correct, in a little while someone would surely arrive, so they had best hide themselves.
They chose a part of the colonnade where the tripods cast no light, and they placed themselves there just in time, because the steps of someone arriving could be heard.
From the left side of the iconostasis they saw Zosimos enter, wrapped in a cloak that looked like Rabbi Solomon's. Buandulino had an instinctive reaction of anger and felt like going out into the open and laying hands on that traitor. Obsequiously the monk preceded a sumptuously dressed man, followed by two other figures. The respectful attitude of these two made it clear that the first man was the Basileus Andronicus. The monarch stopped short, struck by the scene. He blessed himself devoutly before the iconostasis, then asked Zosimos, "Why did you have me come here?" "My lord," Zosimos answered, I had you come here because true hydromancy can be performed only in consecrated places, establishing the proper contact with the realm of the dead. I am no coward, the basilisk said, crossing himself again, but aren't you afraid of calling up the dead? Zosimos laughed boldly. My lord, I could raise these hands of mine and the sleepers of 10,000 graves in Constantinople would rush obediently to my feet. But I have no need to recall those bodies to life. I possess a portentous object that I will use to establish more rapid contact with the world of shadows. He lighted a firebrand at one of the tripods and held it out to the channel at the rim of the basin. The oil began to burn, and a little crown of flame, running all around the surface of the water, illuminated it with dancing glints. I still see nothing, the basilisk said, bending over the basin.
Ask this water of yours who is the man preparing to take my place.
I sense unrest in the city, and I want to know whom I must destroy to dispel any fear. Zosimos approached the object covered by the red cloth, lying on the little column. With a histrionic gesture he removed the veil, and handed the basilisk a round object he had held between his hands. Our friends couldn't see what it was, but they saw the basilisk draw back, trembling, as if trying to ward off an unbearable sight. No, he said, not this. You asked it of me for your rights, but I didn't know you would have it reappear before me.
Zosimos raised this trophy of his and was presenting it to an imaginary congregation like a monstrance, turning it towards every part of the cavern.
It was the head of a dead child, its features still intact, as if it had just been severed from the trunk. Eyes closed, the nostrils of the slender nose dilated, the little lips barely parted, revealing a full set of tiny teeth. The immobility and the alien illusion of life in that face were made more hieratic by the fact that it appeared to be of a uniform gilded hue, and seemed almost to sparkle in the light of the little flames that Zosimos was now approaching. I had to use the head of your nephew Alexius, Zosimos was saying to the basilisk, for the ritual to be achieved. Alexius was bound to you by blood ties, and his mediation will enable you to communicate with the realm of those who are no more. Then, slowly, he immersed in the water that horrid little object, until it reached the bottom of the basin, over which Andronicus bent, as closely as the crown of flames would allow. The water is turning murky, he said in a whisper. It has found in Alexius the terrestrial element it was awaiting, and it is questioning him, Zosimos murmured. We will wait until this cloud is dispersed. Our friends couldn't see what was happening in the water, but they realized that at a certain point it became clear again and revealed, on the bottom, the face of the boy basilisk. By hell's power, Andronicus stammered, it is finding again its former colors, and I can read some signs that have appeared on his brow. Oh, miracle. Iota, Sigma. You didn't have to be a hydroman to understand what had happened. Zosimos had taken the head of the boy emperor, had incised some layers on the brow, then had covered them with a gilded substance, soluble in water. Now, as that artificial patina dissolved, the wretched victim was giving to the man who had hired his killer the message that obviously Zosimos, or whoever had inspired him, wanted the basilisk to receive. In fact, Andronicus went on spelling it out. Iota, Sigma, is. He straightened up, twisted the hairs of his beard several times in his fingers, seemed to shoot fire from his eyes, bowing his head as if to reflect, then raising it like a fiery horse, barely held in check. Isaac, he cried. The enemy is Isaac Comnenus. What is he plotting there on Cyprus? I will send out a fleet and destroy him before he can move, the wretch. One of the two attendants emerged from the shadows, and Buandulino noted that he had the face of a man prepared to roast his own mother if she failed to put meat on the table. My lord, the man said, Cyprus is too far away, and your fleet would have to go beyond the Propontis, passing the area where now the army of the king of Sicily is spreading. But just as you cannot go to Isaac, so he cannot come to you. I would not think so much of Isaac Comnenus, but rather of Isaac Angelus, who is here in the city, and you know how little love he has for you. Stephen. Andronicus laughed, with contempt. You'd have me worry about Isaac Angelus? How can you think that such a broken-winded, inept, impotent good-for-nothing could even think of threatening me? Zosimos, he said furiously to the necromancer, this water and this head speak to me either of one who is too far away or of another who is too stupid. What good are your eyes if you can't read in this pot full of piss? Zosimos realized that he was about to lose his eyes, but luckily for him, that Stephen who had spoken earlier now spoke up again. From the obvious pleasure with which the man was promising new crimes, Buandulino understood this was Stephen Agiacristophorites, the evil genius of Andronicus, the man who had strangled and decapitated the boy Alexius. My lord, do not scorn portents. You yourself have seen how on the boy's face signs have appeared that were surely not there when he was alive. Isaac Angelus may be a petty weakling, but he hates you. Others, smaller and weaker than he, have made attempts on the life of men great and courageous as you, if ever there have been such.